Experts couldn't repair a stealth combat drone until the general brought a brilliant veteran. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. In a top-secret military base, deep in the Nevada desert, a sleek, stealth combat drone lay motionless on the tarmac. The machine, once a symbol of cutting-edge technology, was now an expensive paperweight. Engineers and techs scrambled, their fingers flying over screens, pressing buttons, and adjusting dials, but nothing worked. The problem seemed insurmountable. The drone's system had a critical failure, one that no modern technology could diagnose. The engineers were baffled. Their state-of-the-art tools, which cost millions of dollars, were useless. The drone refused to start. Each attempt at troubleshooting ended in frustration. The techs grew impatient, their faces turning red with the pressure mounting in the war room. They were used to solving problems with their advanced software and systems, but nothing was getting through to this drone. There was no data, no diagnostics, just a dead piece of machinery. As the sun beat down on the desert, the situation grew more dire. The military had a strict deadline, and this drone was supposed to be part of a highly classified mission that could not afford any delays. Time was running out. A young technician, Mark, slammed his hand on the console in frustration. "This is impossible," he muttered. "Nothing we have is working." His voice was tinged with disbelief. He couldn't believe that a machine as advanced as this could fail so suddenly. His colleague, Sarah, leaned in closer to the screen, her fingers trembling as she tapped away at the keyboard. "We're missing something. This shouldn't be happening." A voice echoed from behind them. "You're right. This shouldn't be happening." The room turned to see an elderly man standing in the doorway, dressed simply in faded jeans and a well-worn shirt. He didn't look like much, just another old veteran who had wandered into the wrong place, the kind of person who might not even understand the advanced technology surrounding him. The engineers exchanged confused glances, but the man remained calm, his eyes sharp as they scanned the drone. He said nothing at first, just walked closer to the machine, observing it with a practiced eye. Mark scoffed under his breath. "Great, now we've got Grandpa in here trying to fix a multi-million-dollar drone." Sarah shot him a look, but she said nothing. The man stood quietly beside the drone for a moment. Then, without a word, he knelt down and peered into a small compartment beneath the drone's wing. His hands moved with precision, his fingers brushing over a set of wires. It was clear he was no stranger to machines. As he worked, he muttered softly, almost to himself. "The wind patterns are affecting the calibration," he said. "It's not the tech, it's the weather sensor calibration. You didn't account for the atmospheric pressure." The young technicians exchanged puzzled glances. Sarah stepped forward. "What? How can you possibly know that?" The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished wrench, which he used to loosen a bolt. The techs watched in silence, unsure what to make of this old man, who seemed to know more about the drone than they did. As he worked, the faint hum of the machinery began to shift. The drone flickered, then powered on for the first time in hours. Mark's eyes widened in disbelief. "No way," he whispered. The machine started to hum, its systems slowly coming back online. The drone's once-dead screen blinked to life. "It's working," Sarah breathed. Just as the techs were about to react, a voice rang out from the doorway. "What's going on here?" The room turned to find a senior officer, Colonel James, one of the base commanders, standing with a mix of impatience and curiosity. The technicians immediately straightened, but before anyone could explain, the elderly man turned to the colonel, his eyes hard and steady. "This machine wasn't broken, Colonel. It just needed someone who actually understood it." Colonel James raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical. "And who might you be?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving the colonel's. He adjusted his worn shirt and stepped back from the drone, now fully operational. "I'm the one who trained the engineers who built this machine," he said quietly. "And I've seen things you wouldn't believe." The room fell silent as the colonel processed the information. He looked down at the drone, now humming with power, and then back at the old man. The colonel stepped forward, his tone softening. I think it's time we brought in someone who can get the job done. He picked up his radio and began issuing orders. Minutes later, a convoy of military vehicles rumbled across the base, heading straight for the hangar. The old veteran had fixed the drone, and now it was time for him to be recognized. The colonel knew the truth. No machine, no matter how advanced, could replace the knowledge of someone who had been there, who had lived through it all. The veteran's work had saved the day, and soon, everyone in the room would know it. The question was, would they accept it? The drone, now fully operational, hummed quietly as the technicians stood in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The elderly man, who had simply walked into the room and fixed what seemed to be an unsolvable problem, stood calmly next to the machine. His eyes never wavered as he surveyed the now functioning system. He didn't need to say much. His actions spoke louder than words. Mark, still in disbelief, slowly walked over to the drone, his hand hovering over the controls as if unsure whether to trust them. Sarah, equally speechless, watched him, her mind racing. How could someone who looked so ordinary have such an extraordinary grasp of technology? Colonel James, who had just entered the hangar, stood with his arms crossed, his gaze flicking from the drone to the old man. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice calm, but with an edge of authority. The man turned to him, his face weathered by years of experience. "I'm the one who knows how this drone should be operated," he replied simply. The colonel's eyes narrowed as he studied the man for a moment longer. He had never seen anyone approach a machine like this before, without a single tool or a computer. Yet here, in front of him, stood someone who had, in an instant, brought the drone back to life. "You worked on this project?" Colonel James asked, still unsure of the man's credentials. "I worked on the very first prototype," the man answered. "I trained the engineers who designed it. They missed a detail, a small one, but it was enough to ground this machine." The colonel's face softened slightly as he processed the information. The old man wasn't just some mechanic or janitor. He was part of the very foundation of the military's technological advancements. "I see," the colonel said slowly. "And what's your name, sir?" The man looked him square in the eye, his expression unflinching. "My name is Jack Dawson." The name didn't ring any bells for the colonel, but the way Dawson said it, so matter-of-factly, told him everything he needed to know. This was no ordinary veteran. Dawson turned his attention back to the drone, his hand resting lightly on its sleek surface. "I've seen this drone go through its paces. I know its strengths, and more importantly, I know its weaknesses," he continued. "This isn't about fixing a machine, it's about understanding it. Technology may fail, but experience never does." The colonel, now intrigued, stepped forward. "I don't know what your background is, Dawson, but you just saved this operation. Do you know what this drone was supposed to do today?" Dawson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gave the machine a long, thoughtful look. "I don't need to know the details. I can already tell that the problem was more about the environment than the system itself." Mark, still standing by the console, turned to Colonel James. "Sir, this man fixed the drone. We've been at this for hours, and it just started up like it was nothing." The colonel nodded slowly, his mind processing everything he had just heard. "I can see that." His gaze shifted back to Dawson. "We have a mission scheduled. I was about to call it off." Dawson raised a hand, cutting him off. "You don't need to cancel it, Colonel. Just take this machine to the launch pad, and it'll perform just fine. It's ready. It always has been." The colonel's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the response he had expected. This man didn't ask for recognition, didn't boast about his work. He simply got things done. "Well then, let's get this drone in the air. But first, I need to know who you really are," the colonel said, his tone turning serious. Dawson didn't flinch. "I'm a man who's seen more than most. I've been to places that don't show up on any map, and I've done things that no one else could." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded, as if accepting the truth in Dawson's words. "All right, we'll talk later. Right now, we have a mission to complete." Dawson didn't respond. He simply turned back to the drone, giving it a final inspection. He knew the colonel was right. They had a mission to complete, and no one could afford delays. As the technicians moved to ready the drone for launch, Dawson stepped aside. He didn't want the limelight. His role was clear, to ensure that the drone could perform as it was designed to. In that moment, he wasn't looking for accolades or attention. He had done his job, and that was all that mattered. As the drone powered up and began to taxi down the runway, the tension that had gripped the hangar seemed to dissipate. The engineers, still in awe of Dawson's abilities, exchanged silent glances, and for the first time, they saw what true expertise looked like. Colonel James gave a small nod to Dawson, who stood at the side, his hands in his pockets, watching the drone take flight. This was the kind of man who didn't need recognition. He was a man of action, a man who had served his country in ways that no one else could understand. The drone soared into the sky, a symbol of what could be achieved when the right person, with the right experience, was in charge. And Dawson, once again, had proven that his experience was the key to success. This mission, like many others, had been saved by the wisdom of a veteran who knew how to make the impossible possible. "I can't believe it," Mark whispered, still staring at the empty sky as the drone disappeared into the clouds. The mission was back on track, thanks to Dawson. The man had come in with nothing but his expertise and an unshakable calm, and in minutes, the drone was airborne, performing flawlessly. The weight of the situation, the pressure of saving an entire operation, had lifted from their shoulders. Colonel James stood beside him, watching the drone as it reached altitude. "It's unbelievable," the colonel muttered, his eyes never leaving the horizon. "But it's real." Mark glanced at the colonel, trying to grasp the significance of what had just happened. He had never seen anything like it. In a world where technology was supposed to solve every problem, here was an old man who had simply understood what was wrong when no one else could. "Who is he?" Mark asked. The colonel looked over at him. "That's Jack Dawson," he said quietly. "He's a legend. He was there when they first started building these machines. He knows them inside out." Mark's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "He built these drones." The colonel nodded, his tone still tinged with respect. "He helped design them, train the engineers. He's been around longer than most of us." Mark was still processing the fact that the man who had just saved their mission was a living legend. He had heard the name, of course, but it had always been in hushed whispers, stories about the old veteran who had done things in wars most people could never imagine. But seeing him in action? That was something else entirely. Dawson was no ordinary man. He didn't act like a hero. He didn't want praise. He just did what needed to be done. And that's what made him so extraordinary. The rest of the technicians were gathering around the control room, their expressions a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Did you see that?" one of them said, his voice still shaky. "He just walked up, took a look, and fixed it. Just like that." Sarah, who had been quieter than usual, nodded. "It wasn't just that," she said. "It was the way he did it. Like he'd done it 1,000 times before." As the drone continued its flight path, Colonel James took a deep breath, steadying himself for the next steps. "All right, everyone," he said, his voice authoritative. "Let's focus. We've got a mission to finish, but we're not done yet. The next phase of this operation is critical. We need to prepare for launch." He turned to Mark, who was still looking at the screen, his mind racing. "Mark, get everything ready for the next step. We're going to need that drone to do its job, and we can't afford any more delays." Mark snapped out of his reverie and nodded, rushing to his station to prepare for the next phase of the mission. The tension was still there, but now it felt manageable. Dawson had given them a fighting chance. Meanwhile, Dawson stood off to the side, watching the team prepare for what was next. He hadn't asked for any recognition. He wasn't there for the accolades. He was simply there to do his job, and that's exactly what he did. He had seen too many people in the military come and go, but there was something different about him. He wasn't defined by the number of medals or the stories that followed him. He was defined by his ability to get things done when others couldn't. He was the one you called when everything else failed. And in that moment, standing quietly as the mission continued, Dawson knew that his work here was done. He didn't need the fanfare. He didn't need the limelight. The drone was back in the air. The operation was moving forward. That's all that mattered. As the preparations continued, Dawson's mind drifted briefly back to the days when he was younger, when the world seemed full of endless possibilities. The wars, the missions, the sacrifices, he had done it all. But now, in the quiet after the storm, he found himself content with just one thing: helping others. That was enough. The drone's mission was underway. The team was moving forward. And Dawson, the man who had seen and done it all, was once again fading into the background, allowing others to take the lead. But as he turned to walk away, he heard a voice behind him. "Mr. Dawson, Colonel James called out. Dawson turned, raising an eyebrow. Yes, Colonel. The colonel's voice was soft but sincere. Thank you, he said. You saved this mission. You saved all of us. Dawson gave a small nod. It was nothing. And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the base, his work done once more. The hours following the successful launch were tense, but there was a strange calm hanging in the air. The drone had completed its mission flawlessly, as Dawson had promised. The team had executed the operation with precision, and the colonel was already on his way to the debriefing, but Dawson remained quietly off to the side. His work, as always, was done, and he wasn't one to seek recognition. He preferred it that way. Unseen, unheard, quietly efficient. However, the word was spreading quickly. The base was buzzing with stories of the man who had saved the mission, the man who had fixed what no one else could. His name, whispered in awe, carried the weight of the legends that had followed him from the past. Yet Dawson wasn't interested in that. He wasn't there to be a legend. He was there to do what needed to be done. As the day wore on, Dawson found himself standing in the mess hall, a place he had often avoided in favor of solitude. It was always filled with young soldiers, all too eager to talk about their accomplishments, their plans for the future, their victories. But today, the mood was different. It wasn't just the success of the mission. There was something else in the air. The young men and women in the hall had seen something they hadn't seen before, respect. And they had seen it given, not to the new technology, but to the man who had lived through it all. Dawson sat at a corner table, nursing a cup of coffee, his gaze distant as he listened to the low hum of conversation. He knew what they were saying. He didn't need to hear the words. They were talking about him, about how he had walked into the hangar and, with nothing but his experience, had solved the problem they couldn't. A part of him wanted to tell them to stop. But another part, the part that had fought in wars, that had spent a lifetime in the shadows, knew that this was the way of things. There would always be people who looked for heroes in the wrong places. And today, they had found one. At that moment, Colonel James entered the mess hall, his expression stern but thoughtful. He scanned the room, his eyes landing on Dawson. The colonel walked over to him, his boots clacking against the tile floor, drawing the attention of a few nearby soldiers. Dawson didn't look up at first. He knew what was coming. Mr. Dawson, the colonel began, his voice quiet but steady. Dawson finally lifted his gaze, meeting the colonel's eyes. Yes, Colonel. The colonel didn't sit. He simply stood there, his posture rigid, his eyes still on Dawson. I've been thinking, he said slowly. You've earned more than just a thank you for what you did today. You've earned recognition. Dawson's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't say anything. The colonel continued, his voice firm. I think it's time for the people here to know who you really are. Dawson shook his head, a small, almost imperceptible smile playing at the corners of his lips. I don't need recognition, Colonel. I've done what was asked of me. That's enough. The colonel paused, then sat down across from him. It's not just about what you've done. It's about the respect you've earned over the years. You've helped more people than anyone here will ever know. It's time they know the full extent of your service. Dawson took a slow sip of his coffee, then set it down. He wasn't sure why he was still here, still having this conversation. But something in the colonel's tone made him pause. The truth is, Colonel James said, his voice low, this base, this operation, it's here because of men like you. You've been in places no one else would go. You've done things that no one else could. Dawson sighed, his gaze flickering to the door. I've done what I had to do. But that was a long time ago. The colonel leaned forward, his voice becoming more intense. And what if we told everyone here? What if they knew the man who designed these drones, who brought them back from the brink? What if they knew who you really were? Dawson's face hardened for a moment. He had known this day would come, but he wasn't sure he was ready for it. I'm not that man anymore, Colonel, Dawson said quietly. I'm just an old veteran. I'm not here for the spotlight. The colonel looked at him for a long moment before standing up. He gave a small nod. I get it. But the people here, the ones who look up to you, they deserve to know the truth. Dawson didn't respond. The colonel laughed, but the weight of his words lingered in the air. Dawson sat there for a long while, alone in the mess hall, lost in his thoughts. It was true that he had done things most people couldn't imagine. He had seen things that others would never have the courage to face. But those days were behind him. The world had changed, and so had he. He wasn't the same man he used to be. Yet as he sat there, He couldn't shake the feeling that his past, though it was buried deep, had come back to the surface. It wasn't just the mission that had drawn attention to him. It was the fact that he was still here, still alive, still able to help when needed. That, more than anything, had earned him the respect of those around him. And maybe, just maybe, that was all he needed. The following morning, Dawson was called to the command center. It wasn't unusual for veterans like him to be summoned, but the way the request had come through felt different. There was a certain weight behind it, something unspoken in the colonel's voice. When Dawson arrived, the tension in the room was palpable. Several officers stood around a table, discussing plans and strategies, but their eyes kept drifting toward him, a mix of respect and curiosity. Dawson's presence had clearly stirred something beneath the surface. He stood quietly at the door, waiting for someone to acknowledge him. Finally, Colonel James looked up, his expression unreadable, but with a subtle nod that welcomed Dawson into the room. "Mr. Dawson, I need to speak with you," the colonel said, his tone firm yet not unkind. Dawson nodded, stepping inside and standing silently. The officers continued their discussions, but it was clear that they were aware of his presence now. The colonel gestured to an empty chair beside him. "Please, take a seat," he offered. Dawson took the chair, his hands resting on his lap as he awaited whatever would come next. The colonel cleared his throat and looked around the room, as if gathering his thoughts before speaking. "What happened yesterday with the drone? It's no small feat, but I think you and I both know that what you did wasn't just about fixing a piece of equipment. It was about something more." Dawson said nothing, simply nodding. He had known this moment would come. The respect was there, and the curiosity too. What he hadn't expected was how quickly it had turned into something more formal, something larger than himself. "We need people like you on the front lines, Dawson," Colonel James continued. "Not just in the field, but in leadership roles, guiding the younger generation." Dawson shook his head slightly. "I'm not here for that, Colonel. I've done my time. I'm not interested in leading anyone." The colonel's gaze softened, but his voice remained firm. "But we need you. You may not realize it yet, but you have a unique perspective, one that can teach these younger officers what it means to truly lead, not just give orders." Dawson leaned back in his chair, his mind racing. He wasn't a man who sought accolades, nor was he someone who wanted to be thrust into the limelight. But he understood the colonel's point. The younger generation was full of potential, but they lacked the experience, the lived knowledge that only came with time and sacrifice. "I'm not interested in being some kind of mentor," Dawson said quietly. "I'm just here to help when I can. That's enough for me." The colonel studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I respect that. But just know this. Your experience is something we can't ignore. I've spoken with General Thompson. He agrees with me. We want you to stay on this base, to be part of something larger." Dawson felt a flicker of surprise at the mention of the general's name. "General Thompson?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yes. We've been discussing ways to integrate veterans like you into future operations, ensuring that the lessons of the past aren't lost on those who will lead tomorrow. You've been a part of something bigger than yourself, and it's clear that you still have the ability to contribute in ways most can't." Dawson leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "I'm not some symbol of the past. I'm just a man who's seen a lot and learned a lot. I can still help, but I don't want to be a figurehead." The colonel chuckled softly. "I understand, but you'd be surprised how many people here look to you for guidance, even without you knowing it." Dawson paused, taking in the weight of the colonel's words. There was truth to it, he realized. Over the years, he had seen how young soldiers, even those with all the modern technology at their disposal, often faltered in the face of uncertainty. It was the hard-earned wisdom of veterans like him that helped them push through. "I can still teach them a thing or two," Dawson said quietly. "But that's all I'll do. I'm not looking for anything more." The colonel's expression softened. "That's all we ask, Dawson. Just your experience. We don't need you to lead, but we do need you to be here, to share what you know." Dawson nodded slowly. He wasn't ready to commit to anything, but the thought of being able to help, even in a small way, had a certain appeal. As the conversation wrapped up, the colonel stood and extended his hand. "Thank you for your time, Dawson. We'll keep you updated on any future developments." Dawson stood as well, shaking the colonel's hand firmly. "I'll be here," he said, his voice steady, "if you need me." As he walked out of the command center, Dawson couldn't shake the feeling that his time at this base was far from over. He had come here to help in the shadows, to fix problems when they arose. But now it seemed that his role might be shifting. He wasn't looking to be a leader or a figurehead, but perhaps there was something more he could do. After all, the past had a way of catching up with you, even when you weren't looking. Dawson walked down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the quiet corridors. He wasn't sure where this new chapter would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next few days passed by quickly, but Dawson couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting in the air. The quiet request to stay on the base, to be part of something more, had lingered in his mind. He had always prided himself on staying out of the spotlight, on helping when needed, and fading into the background when it was over. But now, with the colonel's words echoing in his mind, it seemed as though his presence was being demanded more than ever. He found himself in the briefing room one morning, sitting quietly in the back corner, observing the young officers as they prepared for their next operation. They were fresh-faced, eager, and filled with the kind of energy that only the young could possess. But as he watched them, he saw something else too: uncertainty. They had the best equipment, the most advanced technology, but they lacked the experience to make it all come together. They had the tools, but they didn't know how to use them when things didn't go as planned. Dawson had seen that look before. The look of soldiers who knew how to follow orders, but didn't know what to do when the orders weren't enough. He had been there himself once, standing in the heat of battle, wondering if anyone had a plan that would work. As the briefing went on, Dawson's gaze moved to the front of the room, where Colonel James stood, outlining the mission. It was a delicate operation, involving a series of coordinated drone strikes. But the colonel's focus seemed to drift every now and then, and Dawson could sense that the younger officers, though well-prepared, lacked a certain confidence. They hadn't been tested in the field yet, not like Dawson had. They hadn't faced the kind of danger that made every decision feel like it could be their last. The briefing came to an end, and the officers began to disperse. Dawson stood up and walked toward the door, but before he could leave, Colonel James called him over. "Dawson," the colonel said, his voice quieter now. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" Dawson nodded and approached the colonel, who motioned for him to sit. "I know you're not interested in the spotlight," the colonel said, "but I need you to consider something. The operation is critical, and the team is good, but they need something else. They need experience. I'm asking if you would be willing to work more closely with them, to help guide them through the mission." Dawson sat in silence for a moment, letting the words sink in. He hadn't expected this. He had always been an outsider in the world of modern warfare, preferring to stay in the background, fixing problems without drawing attention. But the colonel was right. These officers, as capable as they were, needed someone who had seen it all, someone who could help them navigate the unknown. Dawson had always known that experience was the most valuable asset a soldier could have, and now he was being asked to share that with the next generation. "I'm not looking to lead, Colonel," Dawson said finally, his voice low but firm. "But I'll help where I can. They need guidance, and if I can give that, I will." The colonel smiled, relieved. "Thank you, Dawson. That's all I'm asking for. We don't need a leader, but we do need someone who understands what it takes to get through an operation like this. Your experience is invaluable." Dawson stood up, nodding. "I'll be there when you need me." As he walked out of the briefing room, Dawson felt a sense of purpose settle in his chest. He wasn't there to take charge, but he was there to make sure things went right. He was the bridge between the past and the future, between the old ways of warfare and the new. The next day, he found himself in the field with the young officers, standing side by side as they prepared for the operation. He could see their nerves, their hesitation, but also their determination. They had the right equipment, the right training, but they were missing the one thing that could make it all come together: experience. Dawson moved among them, offering quiet words of advice when needed, never pushing himself into the spotlight, but always ready when they needed him. As the operation unfolded, Dawson could see how the young officers began to settle into their roles, their confidence growing as they followed the plan. They made a few mistakes along the way, but Dawson was there to guide them, offering wisdom from his years of experience. The mission was a success, and though Dawson didn't expect any praise or recognition, he could see the difference he had made. The young officers had learned something important: how to trust their instincts when the plan began to unravel. They had learned that there were no perfect plans, only the ability to adapt and survive. As the operation concluded, Dawson stood quietly in the back of the room as the team celebrated. He wasn't interested in the cheers, the applause, or the accolades. He had done his job. He had helped guide them, and that was enough. The colonel approached him once again, his face showing a mixture of gratitude and respect. You did more than just help them, Dawson. You gave them something they couldn't have learned in a classroom. You gave them experience. Dawson nodded, but said nothing. He wasn't there for recognition, and he never would be. He was just a man who had been through the fire and come out the other side, and now, he was helping the next generation do the same. It was enough. As he walked away from the celebration, Dawson felt a quiet satisfaction. He had found his place once again, not in the spotlight, but in the shadows where his experience could make the most difference. And for him, that was all he needed. The days that followed were filled with a steady stream of missions and debriefings. Dawson continued to work with the young officers, offering quiet guidance, and though he never sought attention, it was clear that his presence was making an impact. The younger officers had started to trust him more, seeking his advice when they faced decisions that didn't have clear answers. It was a different kind of leadership, one that didn't demand respect but earned it through experience and action. Dawson was fine with that. He had never wanted to be a figurehead or a leader in the traditional sense. He simply wanted to help where he could, to pass on the knowledge he had gained from decades of service. One afternoon, after a particularly successful mission, Colonel James called Dawson into his office. The colonel's demeanor was different this time. There was no more hesitation, no more uncertainty. It was as if Dawson had proven something not just to the team, but to the colonel as well. Dawson, the colonel began, his voice steady. I want to thank you for everything you've done these past few weeks. The team has made incredible progress, and it's clear to me now that we couldn't have done it without you. Dawson nodded, but the words weren't necessary. He had known all along that his role was to provide the guidance and experience that the young officers lacked. It wasn't about being thanked. It was about ensuring they were ready for whatever came next. The colonel continued, I've spoken to General Thompson, and he wants to recognize your contributions. It's long overdue. Dawson was silent for a moment, letting the words settle in. Recognition wasn't something he sought, but he knew it was inevitable. He had been part of something much larger than himself. His presence had made a difference, and now, the general wanted to ensure that the rest of the base knew it. I'm not looking for a ceremony or a medal, Colonel, Dawson said quietly. The colonel smiled, understanding the sentiment. I know, but this is bigger than just you. It's about the lessons you've taught these soldiers. We need them to understand that experience is just as valuable as the latest technology. The veterans like you are the ones who keep everything together when it matters most. Dawson sat back, contemplating the colonel's words. He wasn't someone who wore his past on his sleeve, but he knew the truth in what the colonel was saying. It was the veterans, the ones who had been through the toughest battles, who understood what it took to survive when everything else was failing. The young officers had the tech, the training, and the potential, but without someone to guide them through the unknown, it was all for nothing. I'm just doing my part, Colonel, Dawson said softly. The colonel nodded, then stood up and walked over to a cabinet behind his desk. He opened it and pulled out a small, unadorned box. He placed it in front of Dawson. This isn't for show, the colonel said, his voice serious. It's a simple gesture, but one that means something. Dawson looked down at the box, curiosity stirring within him. He opened it slowly, revealing a worn, but polished challenge coin, a token of honor and respect given to those who had gone above and beyond. I know this isn't much, the colonel continued, but it's a reminder that you've earned more than just our gratitude. You've earned the respect of everyone on this base. And that's something you can't buy with technology or rank. Dawson picked up the coin, turning it over in his hand. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it meant more to him than any medal or formal recognition could. It was a symbol of the bond between those who had served, who had fought and sacrificed, and who understood the true value of experience. As he left the colonel's office, coin in hand, Dawson couldn't help but think about the past. He had been to places and seen things that no one else would ever understand. But that was the point. It wasn't about the battles or the stories. It was about what he could pass on, what the next generation could learn from him. That was why he had stayed, why he had agreed to help. The base had changed since he first arrived. The younger officers had grown more confident, more capable, and he had seen them come together as a team. They were ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. As he walked back to his quarters, the weight of the coin in his pocket reminded him of how far he had come, and how much further he still had to go. There was still work to be done, still lessons to be taught, and still soldiers who needed his guidance. Dawson wasn't finished yet, and he knew that the work he had started wouldn't be over until he had passed on everything he knew. He wasn't looking for recognition, but the respect he had earned meant everything. It wasn't about the medals or the coins. It was about making sure the legacy of those who had come before wasn't forgotten. And as long as he could still teach, still share his experience, he would keep doing his part. It was his responsibility, and he would never walk away from it. Weeks passed, and Dawson found himself slipping into a routine. It wasn't the kind of routine he had been used to in his younger days, not the adrenaline-filled days of combat, but one of subtle guidance. The younger officers, who had once approached him with uncertainty, now sought him out for advice with a quiet respect. It wasn't always direct. Often, it was in the form of casual conversations, small questions that seemed insignificant at first, but revealed much about the challenges they faced. Dawson had become their quiet anchor. His presence didn't command attention. It was simply there, a steadying force in the background. He hadn't asked for this role, but he had embraced it nonetheless. He had learned long ago that the real work was in those small moments, those quiet exchanges, where real leadership was forged. One afternoon, as Dawson sat in the base's small library, flipping through a worn military manual, a familiar voice interrupted his concentration. "Mr. Dawson, we need you in the field," said Lieutenant Harris, one of the younger officers who had worked closely with him in the past. Dawson looked up from his book, surprised. "In the field?" he repeated, raising an eyebrow. "What's going on?" "It's the drones," Lieutenant Harris explained. "We've got a new batch coming in for testing. The engineers are struggling with a glitch they can't figure out. They've already called in a few experts, but no one's been able to crack it. We think it's something with the calibration, but we're not sure." Dawson set the book aside and stood up slowly. He didn't need to be told twice. There was always something about a challenge that drew him in. He wasn't there to replace anyone. He wasn't there to steal the spotlight. He was there because he had the experience to solve the problem. As Dawson and Lieutenant Harris made their way to the testing facility, Dawson's mind raced. He had seen this type of issue before, but he had never dealt with this particular model. Still, he knew the underlying principles, the systems that governed the machines. When they arrived, the engineers were already deep into their diagnostics, their faces lined with frustration. Dawson took a moment to assess the situation. The new drones were sleek, cutting-edge, the latest in unmanned aerial technology. But beneath the shiny surface, he could tell something was off. He approached the drone, his hands slipping into his pockets as he studied the machine. One of the engineers, a young man named Grant, stepped forward. "We've been at it for hours, sir," Grant said, his voice tinged with desperation. "We've run diagnostics, replaced several components, but the system keeps rejecting the calibrations. It's as if the drone can't lock onto the right signals." Dawson didn't respond immediately. He moved around the drone, his eyes scanning every angle. The engineers were busy with their high-tech tools, but Dawson relied on something different, his instincts. After a moment of silence, he spoke. "Check the signal interference from the nearby radar towers," Dawson said. "These machines are designed to operate in specific environments, but the interference from high-powered equipment could be causing the malfunction." The engineers looked at each other, unsure. "We've accounted for that," Grant said, trying to remain confident. "We've isolated the signal interference in the diagnostics. It shouldn't be a factor." Dawson nodded slowly. "Then you haven't accounted for the ambient environmental factors. These drones are programmed to calibrate in a controlled environment, but they're not accounting for changes in altitude and temperature. It's subtle, but it's there." The room fell silent as the engineers processed his words. Finally, Grant nodded. "We haven't adjusted for altitude changes. The environmental settings are still at base level." Dawson smiled to himself. It was a simple fix, but one that required a seasoned eye to spot. He gestured to the engineers. "Make the adjustments. Test it again." Grant didn't hesitate. He moved quickly, inputting the adjustments into the system. The other engineers followed suit, and within minutes, the drone's systems were humming back to life. Dawson stood back, his arms crossed as he watched the display. The drone systems synced perfectly. The glitch was gone. Grant looked at Dawson, his face lighting up with a mixture of relief and awe. It's working. It's really working. Dawson simply nodded. That's how it's done, he said quietly. He hadn't done it for the praise, but there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that his years of experience had made the difference. As the engineers began the next phase of testing, Lieutenant Harris approached Dawson, his expression thoughtful. That was impressive, he said. I don't think anyone else would have figured it out. Dawson looked at him, his expression unreadable. It's not about being impressive, he said. It's about knowing when to trust the tools you have and when to rely on what you've learned. Harris nodded, absorbing the lesson. Dawson wasn't trying to be a hero. He didn't want to be a figurehead. He was just doing what he knew best, passing on his knowledge in a way that felt right. As the day drew to a close, Dawson found himself alone in the hangar, watching the last of the drones being prepped for transport. The mission had been a success, and the engineers had learned something valuable. They had seen firsthand the difference experience could make. And Dawson? He was content with that. He wasn't interested in medals or recognition. His work was never about that. It was about ensuring that the next generation of soldiers, engineers, and officers had the tools they needed to succeed. As the base settled into a quiet night, Dawson walked out into the fading light, knowing that his role here wasn't finished. He would continue to teach, to guide, and to make sure that the lessons of the past were never forgotten. It wasn't about glory. It was about making a difference when it mattered most. The following weeks felt like a blur to Dawson. He had settled into a rhythm at the base, quietly working behind the scenes, guiding the young officers, and offering his expertise when needed. The operations had become smoother, more efficient, thanks in part to his input, but he knew better than to take too much credit. He wasn't interested in being in the spotlight. His role was clear: to help the next generation avoid the mistakes he had made and to provide them with the kind of experience that couldn't be taught in classrooms or simulated in exercises. He had seen the change in the young officers. They had started to trust their instincts more, to make decisions with the confidence that came from knowing they could rely on their training and experience. But it wasn't just the officers who had changed. Dawson could see how the younger engineers had grown as well. They had become more adept at troubleshooting, more resourceful when things didn't go according to plan. It was clear that his presence had made a difference, even if it wasn't always in ways they could articulate. They were learning from him without realizing it. And that, Dawson knew, was the most important part. One afternoon, just as Dawson was about to leave the office after another long day, he received a message from Colonel James. It was brief, but to the point. Dawson, I need you in the operations room immediately. Dawson raised an eyebrow, but didn't hesitate. There had been no warning of any problems, no mention of an urgent situation. So what had changed? As he walked through the familiar halls of the base, Dawson felt a sense of unease settle in his chest. Something was different. When he arrived in the operations room, he was met with a tense atmosphere. Several officers were gathered around the table, their faces serious, their eyes glued to the monitors. Colonel James looked up as Dawson entered. Good. You're here, the colonel said, his voice tight. We've got a situation. Dawson took a seat, his eyes scanning the room. What's going on? It's a cyber attack, the colonel replied, his tone grim. A foreign entity has gained access to our systems. We don't know the full extent of the damage yet, but it's affecting everything: communications, satellite feeds, even the drones. Dawson's brow furrowed. How bad is it? The colonel's eyes hardened. Bad enough that we can't rely on our systems anymore. We've got teams trying to contain it, but we're not sure how deep this goes. We need someone with your experience to help us figure out what to do next. Dawson nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of the situation. He had dealt with cyber warfare before, but never on this scale. What do you need me to do? We need someone to analyze the problem from the ground up, the colonel said. You're not going to be working with the text this time. We need you to go out into the field, get eyes on the problem, and help us strategize. We're working blind right now. Dawson stood up, his mind already running through the possibilities. Understood. I'll get on it. As Dawson left the operations room, the gravity of the situation began to settle in. This wasn't just about technology or machines. It was about the security of everything they had worked for, everything they had built. He had been through countless operations before, but this was different. The unknown had always been a part of war, But now it was staring them in the face in the form of invisible enemies, operating from behind screens instead of guns. Dawson wasn't sure who they were up against, but he knew this was a battle unlike any he had fought before. He met up with Lieutenant Harris and a team of engineers in the command center, where they began to discuss their approach. Harris looked anxious, his usual confidence now replaced by uncertainty. "We've got a lot of data to sift through," Harris said, his voice tight. "But without knowing who's behind this, we're flying blind." Dawson looked at the screen, where rows of encrypted data were flooding in. He knew the drill. First, you isolate the variables. Then, you look for patterns. There was no time to waste. "Start by analyzing the common points," Dawson instructed. "Find the entry point, figure out where they've breached, and work backwards. Don't waste time chasing shadows. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with." The engineers worked quickly, pulling up schematics and analyzing the data, but Dawson could see that they were struggling to make sense of the chaos. "This is a bigger operation than we thought," Harris muttered, staring at a screen full of garbled code. "I don't think we can stop it without outside help." Dawson shook his head, his focus unwavering. "We're not calling for help yet. We're dealing with this ourselves." As they worked late into the night, Dawson's mind raced. He had been through countless battles in his career, but this was something new, something that required a different kind of warfare. This wasn't about guns or bombs. It was about knowledge, strategy, and precision. It was a battle of minds. The night passed in a blur of analysis and troubleshooting. Every lead seemed to go nowhere, but Dawson never stopped looking for answers. By the early hours of the morning, he had a breakthrough. A pattern emerged, a small, subtle flaw in the system that had been exploited. It wasn't a full breach, but it was enough. Dawson turned to Harris, his face grim. "I know where they've hit. We're going after it." They made their way to the field where the drones were stationed, Dawson's mind already calculating the next steps. The enemy may have had the advantage in the virtual world, but in the real world, Dawson knew they still had a chance. This was his domain, where experience and expertise trumped everything else. And no matter how high-tech the enemy's attack, they could not outsmart him in the field. As they set to work, Dawson felt a rare surge of confidence. This battle was far from over, but he knew one thing for certain. He would never back down from a challenge. Not as long as there was work to be done. The operation was in full swing. Dawson stood at the edge of the field, watching the drone teams prepare for the next phase of the mission. The engineers had managed to trace the source of the cyber attack, and now it was up to them to apply the solution. The breach had been subtle, an expertly crafted piece of code designed to exploit the drone's communication systems. But Dawson had identified the flaw, and the team was now racing against the clock to prevent any further damage. Lieutenant Harris was at the front of the team, his face set with determination. He had grown much more confident under Dawson's guidance, though there was still a sense of apprehension in his eyes. "We've got everything we need, sir," Harris said, turning to Dawson as he approached. "The engineers have patched up the system. We're ready to go." Dawson nodded. "Good. Now, we stay ahead of the enemy. We can't afford to let them regroup." Harris looked at him, his eyes searching. "You really think we can do this, sir?" Dawson paused, his gaze drifting to the horizon, where the first light of dawn was breaking. "We have no choice," he said quietly. "We're already in this deep. We can't back down now." Harris didn't respond, but Dawson could see the weight of the mission settling on his shoulders. The stakes had never been higher. They weren't just fighting for the success of the mission. They were fighting for the security of the base, the entire operation, and everyone's lives. The enemy had already proven their ability to infiltrate their systems. If they succeeded in breaching the drones, again, it could mean disaster. But Dawson wasn't about to let that happen. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Dawson and Harris worked closely with the engineers, monitoring the system's integrity and making sure the drones were running at full capacity. Every now and then, they had to make adjustments as new data came in, but Dawson had a calm, steady hand. His experience had taught him how to navigate moments of uncertainty, how to keep his focus when everything seemed to be falling apart. It wasn't long before they were ready to launch the first drone. As it soared into the sky, Dawson's heart raced with anticipation. The drone's mission was critical. It would fly a recon route over enemy territory, gathering intelligence to prepare for the next phase of their counterattack. They couldn't afford a single error. As the drone disappeared into the sky, Dawson watched the control monitors with a sharp eye, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. Harris stood by his side, his posture tense. "Everything looks good," Harris said, though his voice betrayed the unease he still felt. "Let's just hope the patch holds." Dawson didn't answer right away. He was too focused on the data coming through the screen. The drone was flying steadily, sending back valuable reconnaissance. Everything seemed to be going according to plan, but Dawson knew better than to get too comfortable. The enemy would be watching, waiting for any sign of weakness. Then, suddenly, the drone's signal began to flicker. The screen went black for a split second, then returned with a series of garbled, unreadable data. Dawson's heart skipped a beat. "They're trying to take it down," he muttered. Harris looked at him, his face pale. "What do we do?" Dawson's fingers flew across the keyboard as he worked quickly to regain control. He could feel the familiar rush of adrenaline, the way it sharpened his focus. The enemy was making their move, but Dawson wasn't about to let them win. "Reboot the system," he said, his voice calm. "We've got to force a reset before they gain full control." Harris followed the order without hesitation, his fingers moving quickly to initiate the emergency reboot. Dawson watched the monitors closely, his eyes narrowing as the signal slowly began to stabilize. It wasn't over yet, but they were regaining control. Then, just as the drone systems were coming back online, the control room was flooded with urgent messages. "Incoming breach," one of the engineers called out, his voice tinged with panic. "It's a full-scale attack. They're pushing everything they have." Dawson's mind raced. He had seen this before, an all-out cyber assault designed to overwhelm their systems. But this time, they weren't dealing with amateurs. These were professionals, and they were determined to get through. "Give me a direct line to command," Dawson ordered, his voice firm. "We need to implement countermeasures, and we need to do it now." As the team scrambled to respond, Dawson continued to monitor the drones in the field. The first one was still flying, its mission ongoing, but the enemy wasn't backing off. They had learned to adapt quickly, but Dawson had learned even faster. The engineers worked frantically in the background, setting up firewalls and scrambling the signals. But Dawson knew they needed more than just reactive measures. They needed a plan, something the enemy couldn't predict. "Harris," Dawson said, his voice low, "we're going to give them something they don't expect. We're going to use the drones to set a trap." Harris looked at him, confused. "What do you mean, sir?" Dawson smiled grimly. "We're going to let them think they're winning, and then we're going to turn the tables. Prepare the second drone. This time, we're going to hack their systems." Harris nodded quickly, a spark of realization lighting up his eyes. "Understood, sir." With the second drone prepped and ready for launch, Dawson watched with a keen eye as the team worked to set the trap. The enemy had underestimated them, just like they always did. And now, it was time for the real fight to begin. As the second drone soared into the sky, Dawson's hand rested firmly on the control panel, his mind focused entirely on the task ahead. The battle was far from over, but Dawson knew one thing for certain. They weren't going to give up without a fight. The seconds felt like hours as Dawson watched the second drone ascend into the sky. His mind was focused entirely on the task at hand. The team had executed their plan to perfection, setting the trap for the enemy, who had underestimated them. Now, the real test would begin. As the drone flew higher, sending back real-time data, Dawson's grip tightened on the console. He could feel the tension in the air, a sharp reminder of just how high the stakes were. This wasn't just about fixing a glitch or making adjustments anymore. This was a full-blown fight for control of their systems, and Dawson wasn't about to let the enemy win. Lieutenant Harris stood at his side, his fingers flying over the control panel, managing the data streams coming in from the drone. "It's flying steady, sir. The breach is still holding," Harris said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. Dawson nodded, his eyes scanning the data. The enemy was pushing harder than ever, their cyber attack relentless, but they had made one critical mistake. They underestimated Dawson's ability to outsmart them. The second drone, which had been prepped for this very moment, was now their counterattack. The plan was simple. Let the enemy think they had control, only to turn the tables when they least expected it. Dawson had seen this tactic work in the past. It was a game of patience and strategy, a game the enemy wasn't prepared for. "Harris," Dawson said, his voice calm but firm, "initiate the decoy protocol. We're going to feed them false data, and let them think they've won. Harris hesitated for a brief moment, but then nodded. He had learned to trust Dawson's instincts, even when the plan seemed risky. The decoy protocol was risky, but it was the only move left to them. They couldn't afford to keep fighting blindly. They had to take control back, now. As Harris input the command, the drone began to feed the enemy false data, signals that indicated a complete system failure. The enemy would think they had finally breached the security, that their attack had been successful. Dawson watched the system carefully, waiting for the enemy to take the bait. They didn't disappoint. Almost immediately, the enemy's systems responded, flooding their control panels with false reports and system failures. Dawson could almost hear the panic on the other side of the line as they celebrated their apparent victory. But Dawson wasn't done yet. Now, he said quietly, almost to himself. Now, we hit them where it hurts. Harris, recognizing the moment, quickly initiated the counterattack protocol. Dawson had already anticipated the enemy's next move, and now it was time for them to feel the sting of their own arrogance. The drone's true payload, hidden beneath layers of deception, was now coming into play. The second drone, still under their control, began transmitting real-time data from the heart of the enemy's systems. We've got their communication lines, Dawson said with a smile. Now we shut them down. Harris watched in awe as Dawson's plan unfolded. They were no longer just defending, they were attacking. The enemy was still processing the false data, unaware that the true signals were coming from the drone. The team quickly exploited the breach, isolating the enemy's control systems, cutting off their access to the drones, and forcing them into a defensive position. Dawson could feel the tide turning. The control room was buzzing with activity, but Dawson remained calm. The battle wasn't over yet, but they had seized the initiative. He could almost feel the enemy's frustration on the other side, their attack unraveling as they realized they had been duped. Keep the pressure on, Dawson said, his voice low and steady. They won't give up easily. As the operation continued, Dawson could see the enemy's defenses crumbling. They had underestimated him, and now they were paying the price. The young officers, once uncertain and hesitant, were now moving with a newfound confidence. They had learned something invaluable during this operation. When facing an opponent who uses deception and subterfuge, you fight fire with fire. Dawson had taught them the importance of patience, of waiting for the right moment to strike. He had also taught them that experience was their greatest weapon, something the enemy didn't have. Hours passed, and finally, the last of the enemy's systems went dark. The battlefield had been won. Dawson exhaled slowly, allowing the tension to leave his body. It was over. The young officers in the room were still buzzing with excitement, their faces lit with a mixture of disbelief and exhilaration. Dawson stood silently, letting them revel in their victory. He hadn't done it for the recognition. He had done it to teach them, to help them see what was possible when they used their experience and their brains, not just their technology. Lieutenant Harris approached him, his face glowing with admiration. We did it, sir. We really did it. Dawson gave him a small nod, his expression unreadable. You did it, he said simply. I just helped you see it through. Harris smiled. You don't give yourself enough credit, sir. We couldn't have done it without you. Dawson shrugged, his gaze turning back to the now quiet control room. The job's done. That's all that matters. He walked over to the team, offering quiet words of praise as they prepared to wrap up the operation. Dawson wasn't looking for applause. He wasn't looking for any accolades. But as he looked around at the young officers and engineers, he felt a quiet sense of pride. They had made it through because they had trusted each other, and because they had trusted the lessons he had taught them. And in the end, that was what made all the difference. The following days were a blur of debriefings and analysis. The base was buzzing with the success of the operation, but Dawson remained as quiet and focused as ever. The enemy had been defeated, their cyber attack thwarted, but Dawson knew better than to rest on their laurels. In his experience, success was often followed by complacency, and complacency was dangerous. He had seen it too many times before. The young officers, though proud of their accomplishments, had learned the hard way that victory could be fleeting. They needed to stay sharp, stay focused. That was the lesson Dawson had been trying to teach them all along. As he walked through the halls of the base, Dawson's thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Colonel James approaching, his face serious but not unfriendly. Dawson, We need to talk, the colonel said, his tone measured. Dawson nodded, his expression unchanged. About what, sir? The operation, Colonel James began. I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done. You've made a huge difference, and I don't think the team could have done it without you. Dawson remained silent, simply nodding in acknowledgement. He wasn't looking for praise. But I also wanted to talk about the future, the colonel continued. You've proven yourself time and again, not just with the drones, but with the way you've mentored the officers. I think it's time we start thinking about how we can use your experience in a more formal capacity. Dawson's brow furrowed slightly, but he didn't interrupt. The colonel paused for a moment, his gaze steady. We're looking to create a new training program, something that focuses on hands-on experience. We want veterans like you to lead it, to pass on the knowledge that only someone who's lived through these situations can truly teach. Dawson felt a wave of hesitation. He had spent his entire career avoiding the spotlight, choosing to remain behind the scenes, doing what needed to be done without fanfare. The idea of taking on a leadership role, even in a training capacity, was not something he had ever considered. I'm not sure I'm the right person for that, sir, Dawson said, his voice low. I've never been a trainer, never been one to lead from the front. I've always done my part, but I'm not looking to run a program. The colonel studied him for a moment, as if weighing his words. I understand your hesitation, Dawson, but I've seen the impact you've had on the officers here. You don't need to lead in the traditional sense. What we need is someone who can teach them the things they can't learn in a classroom. Someone who knows what it's like to make decisions under pressure, to live with the consequences of those decisions. Someone who understands the realities of war, not just the theory. Dawson was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. He had never sought recognition, never wanted to be the center of attention. But what the colonel was asking wasn't about recognition. It was about passing on the lessons he had learned over a lifetime of service. It was about making sure that the next generation didn't have to learn those lessons the hard way. You're asking me to be part of something bigger, Dawson said slowly. Something that could have a real impact on these officers. The colonel nodded. Exactly. You've already proven that you can make a difference, even in the smallest moments. But this program, Dawson, could help shape the future of this base, of our entire operation. We need veterans who can teach the right way to lead, the right way to fight. You're one of the few who can do that. Dawson looked away, his gaze falling on the distant horizon through the window. He had spent years running from the past, from the things he had seen and done. But now, the past was catching up with him. The experiences he had carried for so long, the lessons he had learned the hard way, could finally be used for something bigger than himself. He wasn't sure if he was ready for it, but he knew that if he said no, he would regret it. This was his chance to make a lasting difference, to ensure that the next generation was ready for what lay ahead. All right, Dawson said quietly, meeting the colonel's gaze. I'll do it. I'll help you build the program. Colonel James smiled, a look of relief crossing his face. Thank you, Dawson. I knew you'd understand. As they shook hands, Dawson felt a strange weight lift from his shoulders. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the future, about preparing the next generation of soldiers and officers for the challenges they would face. Dawson didn't need to be in charge. He didn't need to be the one calling the shots. But he could teach, he could guide, and he could ensure that the lessons of the past didn't fade into the shadows. The next few weeks were spent planning and organizing the new training program. Dawson worked closely with Colonel James and a team of officers to outline the curriculum, focusing on real-world scenarios and hands-on experience. It was a grueling process, but one that Dawson threw himself into with quiet determination. He wasn't doing this for recognition or glory. He was doing it because he knew it was the right thing to do. As the program began to take shape, Dawson felt a growing sense of purpose. This was the work he had been meant to do, the work he had avoided for so long. And as the first group of officers walked into the training program, ready to learn, Dawson realized that he had finally found his place. He wasn't just a veteran anymore. He was a mentor, a guide, a teacher. And in that role, he would make sure that the legacy of his experience would live on, shaping the future of the military long after he was gone. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Dawson had fully immersed himself in the new training program, guiding the younger officers through real-world scenarios, teaching them how to think on their feet, and showing them how to lead with experience rather than just relying on the latest technology. It wasn't easy, but Dawson found himself more fulfilled than he had been in a long time. The young officers, once uncertain and unsure, had begun to develop a quiet confidence under his mentorship. They didn't need to be coddled, they needed the hard truth, and that's what Dawson gave them. His days were spent on the field, running drills, teaching tactics, and pushing them to think beyond the textbooks and simulations. At night, he would sit in his quarters, reviewing their progress, constantly looking for ways to improve the program. Colonel James had been right. The future of the base, and perhaps even the future of military operations, depended on ensuring that the next generation learned the lessons that couldn't be taught in classrooms. And Dawson had the experience to make sure they did. It was during one of these late nights, after the trainees had gone to bed, that Dawson received a call from General Thompson. "Dawson," the general said, his voice steady but with a note of something important behind it. "I need you here now. We've got a situation." Dawson's stomach tightened. He had learned over the years to trust his gut, and something about the general's tone told him that this wasn't just another routine call. "I'll be there in 10, Dawson replied, already grabbing his jacket. When he arrived at the command center, he was met by Colonel James and a handful of other officers. The room was filled with a palpable tension. Something was wrong. "Dawson, I'm glad you're here," Colonel James said, his eyes intense. "We've got intelligence that suggests an imminent threat. A large-scale operation is coming. We need to be ready." Dawson felt a jolt of adrenaline course through him. This was what he had trained for. This was what the program had prepared them for. The group gathered around a large table, where a digital map displayed key locations around the base and surrounding areas. The briefing was quick and precise. Enemy forces had infiltrated the area and were planning a coordinated strike. "We don't know exactly when they'll hit, but we do know they'll try to breach our defenses and cause as much chaos as possible," General Thompson said, his voice grim. "We need all hands on deck. Dawson, I want you to work directly with the teams. Use everything you've taught them to defend this base." Dawson nodded. His mind was already working, calculating the best course of action. He had trained these officers for this very moment, and now it was time to put their skills to the test. "We'll set up perimeter defenses and go on high alert," Dawson said, his voice steady. "But we need to be mobile. The enemy will likely try to exploit our weaknesses, so we can't stay in one place for too long. We'll need rapid response teams ready to move at a moment's notice." The officers around the table nodded, their faces focused, but Dawson could see the uncertainty in their eyes. This was it. The real deal. The threat they had been training for was finally here. But Dawson wasn't worried. He had seen far worse, and he knew that with the right preparation, they could hold their ground. "Harris," Dawson called, turning to the lieutenant who had become one of his most trusted officers. "I want you to take the west side with your team. Set up an ambush along the main road. We'll draw them in and take them out before they get too close." Harris straightened, his face full of determination. "Understood, sir." Dawson turned to the rest of the team. "The rest of you stay sharp. We'll be on the move. Stay in constant communication, and don't take any unnecessary risks." As the officers scattered to carry out their orders, Dawson felt a sense of quiet pride. They were ready. They had learned the lessons, and now it was time to prove it. Dawson met with the engineers one last time, ensuring that all the systems were functioning properly. The drones were back online, and the team had set up a surveillance network to track the enemy's movements. As he moved toward the edge of the base, where the first line of defense was set up, Dawson couldn't help but reflect on how far they had come. These officers had gone from green recruits to skilled, confident soldiers. They were ready for this. And so was he. The enemy struck at dawn. The first wave was a feint, a diversion meant to draw attention away from their true objective. But Dawson and his team were ready. The drones spotted their approach from miles away, giving them plenty of time to prepare. As the enemy moved into position, Dawson's team hit them hard. The ambush went as planned, and the first wave was decimated before they even had a chance to react. But that was just the beginning. More enemy forces were coming. Dawson's heart raced as the battle intensified. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. And Dawson was in his element. He barked orders over the radio, directing his team with precision, pushing them to hold the line. The young officers were stepping up, making decisions on the fly, just as he had taught them. It was clear that they had learned how to fight, not just react, but think, adapt, and win. As the battle raged on, Dawson kept his focus. The enemy's tactics were predictable, but they were relentless. It was a test of endurance now, and Dawson wasn't about to let them win. Finally, after hours of fighting, the last of the enemy forces were routed. The base had held. Dawson stood, breathing heavily, watching as the last of the retreating soldiers disappeared into the distance. The team had done it. They had proven themselves under fire. They had shown the world, and themselves, that they were ready for anything. As the dust settled, Colonel James approached Dawson, his face a mixture of relief and pride. "You did it, Dawson," the colonel said, his voice thick with respect. "Your team did it." Dawson looked around at the young officers, who were now exchanging high fives and clapping each other on the back. They were no longer just trainees. They were soldiers. "We did it," Dawson said, his voice calm. "You all did." And for the first time, Dawson allowed himself to smile. He had trained them, taught them, and now they had proven they were ready. It had been a long road, but the legacy of his experience would live on in them. The mission had been a success, and that was enough. This emotional story follows a seasoned veteran who has spent years quietly guiding the next generation of soldiers. As he navigates the challenges of modern warfare and cyber threats, he faces moments that test his experience, wisdom, and resilience. The emotional story delves deep into the struggles of the young officers who learn under his watch, discovering the power of patience, tactical knowledge, and leadership. Throughout the emotional story, Dawson, the veteran, faces his own internal battles, as he is called upon to use his experience in a way he never expected. From high-stakes missions to moments of reflection, the emotional story showcases how past experiences shape the future of military operations. Dawson's journey is one of growth, mentorship, and the power of knowledge passed down through generations. In every chapter, the emotional story reveals the deep connection between a veteran and his trainees, showing how they grow from uncertainty to confidence. As the battle intensifies, this emotional story unfolds with unexpected twists and moments of triumph. Through each challenge, the emotional story highlights the sacrifices made by those who have served and the impact of their wisdom on the soldiers who follow in their footsteps. This emotional story is a testament to the power of experience and leadership, showing that even in the most trying of times, it is the lessons learned in the past that will carry the next generation forward.